Okay, we're having definite problems here hooking up, but we'll see how we can go. I'm going to be introducing the speaker. I have been collecting books about books for over 35 years, and I've been displaying and discussing them on websites I've created for over 20 years. So it was only natural that sooner or later I would come across our guest speaker, Kurt Zimmerman. This occurred way too many times in the early days of eBay, the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Someone with the eBay user ID of Z Books frequently outbid me for association copies of books about books that I wanted. All I knew about Z Books at that time was that he or she was from Conroe, Texas, that he or she had more money than I did, and that he or she was creating one hell of a collection of association copies of books about books. And then, lo and behold, on the 8th of June in the year 2007, Z Books, aka Kurt Zimmerman, contacted me via an eBay message. This is what he wrote. "Hi, Jerry. I visited your website a few times and enjoyed it. I am hoping to put together myself one together myself in a somewhat near future. I've got an interest in the history of book collecting and have accumulated a fairly large group of related miscellaneous material over the years. My background in rare books goes back about 20 years. I have a library degree from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in rare books. Worked in the library field for a while with some great bookmen, worked for a couple of book dealers, and ran the book department at Bibliophiles auction house in San Francisco in the mid-1990s. All this was fun, but not very lucrative. I decided I preferred collecting over dealing, having been collecting all along. However, I still do book appraisals on occasions for insurance purposes and donations. For the last 10 years, I've been back here in the Houston area in the family real estate business. This provides me with a flexible schedule, enough money to cover the usual expenses and our 3 teenagers, and leaves a little left over for the book fund. I still stay in touch with a number of book people and try to keep up with the late goings-on in the trade auction world. I belonged to the Grolier Club for a number of years, but went inactive because my schedule didn't permit me to get to New York City much. Where are you located? Any particular areas of specialization? If you ever decide to part with any interesting items, let me know." Kurt created his own website in October 2011, bookcollectinghistory.com, and that's where you can find his popular blog, American Book Collecting. In August 2012, Kurt and his friend Douglas Adams were prime players in Larry McMurtry's last book sale. They bought the entire section of bibliographical pamphlets, which they transported home to a storage unit in 2 overloaded SUVs. I have family living in Texas, and Kurt and Douglas invited me to their storage unit, but I never made it. Instead, I sent them $100, and they sent me more than $100 worth of bibliographical material. In 2014, Kurt and some of his Texas friends got together, and they founded the Book Hunters Club of Houston. Fast forward to July 2018. My wife and I were about to return home to Florida after visiting our oldest son and his family in Copperas Cove, Texas. My wife didn't want to drive through Houston on the way home, so she and my son were talking about taking a different route home, passing some place called Conroe, Texas. My ears perked up, and I said, "I know somebody from Conroe, Texas." And that's how I got to meet Kurt and visit his library. I wrote about the visit on my Sentimental Library blog later that month. 2021 has been a very good year for Kurt Zimmerman. Earlier in the year, the Book Hunters Club of Houston published his book, Rare Book Hunting, Essays and Escapades. I interviewed him about his book for a Rare Book Cafe TV show in May. And none other than Michael Durda recommended the book in a Post article in September. And then to top it all off, Nick Basbanes wrote an article about Kurt and his book collecting in the most recent issue of Fine Books and Collecting. And now he's about to give a presentation before the members of the Florida Bibliophiles Society.
The Bibliophiles.
As soon as I hit the right keys on my laptop, and Kurt will appear on the screen, and he will begin his presentation.
You're going to be here for a minute. What's your name again? Craig. Craig, Robert.
Everybody hear me? Good, good. Well, that intro was a little while back, a few minutes ago, but Jerry covered much of my intro. But I would like to say that email dated from many years ago. So not a lot has changed except the number of years I've been collecting. I'm going into my 33rd year as a book collector. And like he mentioned, I'll just recap briefly. My background, University of Texas, undergraduate in English, got an internship at the Ransom Center. In fact, Rich Orm is on this chat. He was the head librarian at the time and had to oversee me, so to speak, much to his chagrin. But anyhow, I got my start there at the University of Texas with rare books. And I had my library degree, but I ended up going into the book trade. And much of what I'll talk about today is my early mentor, one of them, Dorothy Sloan, who is an antiquarian bookseller from Texas. And so, but first, my collection, some 10,000 items related to the history of book hunting and book collecting, mainly the United States. I have a lot of not just books, but manuscripts, photographs, documents, ephemera. And as Jerry mentioned, I've always focused on the association copies, sentimental copies, copies with a historical interest that perhaps belong to a prominent bookseller or book collector, annotated material. So for me, every book has a story, and that's kind of the way I approach it. And I've always liked to write. And so over the years, I've written quite a number of essays related to either books in my collection or to escapades that I've had hunting books. And about 10 years ago, I started the blog. It's actually in its 10th year, which is hard to believe, but it allows me to get the word out. I've met so many people, if not in person, at least through emails and contact. It's really, you know, as you guys know, part of book collecting is the books, but part of it is who you meet and the experiences from that angle. So anyhow, we put out a book, the Book Hunters Club of Houston. We put out a book of my essays, a selection of them, and escapades, which I will hold up for you. And it came out in early this year, and like Jerry said, he interviewed me about it. And the essays were written over many years, but to my surprise, I've gotten a lot of really, really good feedback, a lot of interest. The sales were much more than I thought they'd be. And so I'm happy. I mean, if I can spread the gospel of book collecting and get people excited about it, that's my goal, primary goal. So my background, like I said, is heavily into rare books. I learned from the best bibliographers and really got some good training early on. I was fortunate. And then I worked in the book trade, and then I also worked at Auction House in San Francisco at Butterfield. Some of you guys may remember that. It's now Bonham's, and I ran the rare book department. So I've been immersed for over 30 years, and I've always tried to stay in touch, even when I went into the real estate business back here in the Houston area. So anyhow, today I'm not going to talk about myself. I'm going to talk about one of my latest escapades, a huge acquisition. But mainly, I wanted to talk about Dorothy Sloan. Dorothy was a Texas bookseller. She just passed away earlier this year. She was born in Houston in 1943. And some of you may have heard of her. She was one of the finest antiquarian booksellers we've had in this generation. And she went to the University of Texas. And in the early 70s, she went out to San Francisco and got a job with Warren Howell at John Howell Books, which at the time how books in San Francisco was one of the greatest booksellers and bookstores in the country for many, many decades. And so she took to it like a fish to proverbial water and loved working there. And she was, you know, a woman in basically a man's field at that time. And as you'll hear a little bit later, I got to spend quite a bit of time with her when I was starting out, and she would tell me stories and different book stories and such. But however, she loved to catalog, and she became very well known for the strength of her cataloging and her use of her reference library and her ability to take an item that wasn't so obvious and show the value of it, and not just in terms of monetary value, but maybe the historical value. So she specialized, Dorothy specialized in Texana, Western Americana, and Latin Americana. And although she knew other areas. So about 1990-ish, I'm in college, and I heard that this bookseller was looking for some part-time help here in Austin. And so I went over and I, quote, interviewed with her, and she was quite a personality. I mean, it's worth taking a few minutes to talk about Dorothy as a personality. She was probably about 50 years old when I first met her, but she looked much younger. She was very physically fit. She loved to garden. She had this tremendous rose garden outside her house. And so she worked from home. And so when she wasn't cataloging books, she was outside moving things around and doing a lot of planning and gardening. And so she also had a wicked sense of humor. And I was this young 23-year-old, 22-year-old, and I sit down with her and she asked me some book stuff, told me that she needed an assistant, and then she cracked some off-color jokes, I think just to shock me a little bit, and laughed, had a big laugh. And I didn't know what quite to make of her, but I said, this person's something else. And so next day she said, show up for work. So I did. And I spent the good part of 1.5 to 2 years with her, sitting next to her, cataloging various collections. Dorothy would, I'll just back up a little bit. She started out Howells. She went to Jenkins Company. She moved back to Texas in 1979 to work for the Jenkins Company, which was famous / infamous nowadays. But the Jenkins Company, Johnny Jenkins, had a tremendous business in Americana, Texana, things like that. So Dorothy went there to come back to Texas. And then in '84, she established her own business as a bookseller. She wanted to go on her own. And she was always on a shoestring budget, but she handled really good material, and she was great at getting consignments and using her connections from her earlier days in the trade to find collections and sell a lot of things. So when she met me, or I met her, she was a very experienced bookseller, but she had just not been on her own too long. So I would sit next to her and catalog. And this was my first exposure to rare book cataloging in a sense for sales. And her reference library, even at the time, this was at she had a 1920s house, big house, like I said, with a garden in the back. But her house was filled with probably 8,000 or 10,000 reference books. And when I was with her, she bought the remnants of the Jenkins reference library, which I had to shovel over in boxes. It was pretty heavy, lots of boxes. She also bought W. Thomas Taylor's reference library. He was a noted fine press printer and rare bookman. So she incorporated that into her collection. And she was amazing at knowing the books. I mean, it's one thing to have a big reference library, but it's another to be able to access off the top of your head. I'm going to go look at this book and I'll pull this one to do the research on the material. So when I was sitting next to her, I would find the book, she'd send me off to find it, or she would, and we would sit there for hours digging into every detail and trying to make every description as complete as possible. Even items that monetarily weren't very much, she would spend a lot of time on. And I soon learned that this caused some issues with consigners and clients, because she was always running behind schedule and getting things done, because it was like the object was to get the book described and not get it out the door. So anyhow, I spent about I've been 30 hours a week with her. And when you sit next to somebody like that, you just can't, and you love books like I did, you can't help but absorb a lot of knowledge and a lot of stories. I remember sitting there, and you guys, many of you might recognize the name Bill Reese. She was friends with Bill Reese, and Reese would call her on the phone, and they would talk, and I would overhear these conversations, and my eyes would just open up because they would talk minutia, but they'd also joke about things. And said Dorothy was in San Francisco in the early 70s, and she was kind of a flower child a little bit too. And when she wasn't book selling, she was having some fun. And this isn't a story that supposedly took place, but I have no doubt that she and Bill in the late 70s had smoked a little weed together occasionally. And I just imagining those two great book people having some fun like that always makes me smile. But the time I met her, she was at the top of her game. She was very well known. She helped, there was the Tex fake issue, all those fake Texas documents came on the market, the fake Texas Declaration of Independence. She was the one that actually discovered and noticed the fake. And so there's a famous book, a biblio book called Tex Fake. And if you read that, she is featured in that prominently. And she wasn't without controversy, though. She was very, she could be very engaging, but she also would for example, that episode, she didn't feel the ABAA, this is in the early 80s, was doing enough to make a stand against the fakes and forgeries. And she actually resigned from the ABAA over it. So she was a very independent woman in that sense. But so while I'm with her, I got to catalog amazing stuff. This is one funny story. Bill Morrow was a Texas collector from the 30s, and he was a true gentleman. I remember meeting him. By the time I met him, he was, early 80s, probably age-wise, in good health. He would come over, and she had his collection on consignment, and she ended up putting out an amazing catalog of his Texas collection. And so I was helping catalog some of that. But I learned this at the time, once I started working for her, she was like a year behind in getting it done. And so one day, there's a knock on the door. It's Bill Morrow, unannounced. And I'm like, oh. And Dorothy welcomes him in. We sit in the living room. It's polite chat. And all of a sudden, Bill Morrow gets up and he starts talking about his books. And here I'm a young guy, and he's pointing out all these rarities and everything. And then he looks at Dorothy and he just looks at me and he says, "Are you going to get my collection done before I die?" And there was a brief pause, and Dorothy said, "Don't worry, Bill, I'll get it done for you." And sure enough, catalog came out. He was super pleased, and he didn't last much longer after that, but she did finally get it to the finish line. And just a couple other stories. J. Frank Dobie is a famous Texas writer and teacher, and wrote many, many things. And she had a huge collection of that, which I got to catalog. And that was a real treat for me. And I looking back, I feel very honored and thankful that she gave me that responsibility, because I was a greenhorn. I mean, literally, I was just learning, and she gave me the responsibility to do basically the whole catalog. Turned out well. It's almost like a second bibliography of his works, because it was such an in-depth collection that was put together by J. Frank's cousin. So this is a person, for me, that was very important in my growth as a bookseller, book collector. She was the one early on that says, if you're going to collect, and I can tell you are, you need to catalog your collection in some form. And she says, if you don't, when you get older, you're going to have a tough time keeping track of everything. And fortunately, I listened to her. And so I have a catalog of my biblio collection, which Jerry, I think, saw a version of it. It's on my computer, but every once in a while I'll print out a copy just so I can see it in bulk. It's now over 1,100 pages long. I don't have everything described, but I have most of it described. And it's thanks to her that I kept track of the material. So anyhow, a little more broader background with her. She put out 12 catalogs while she was on her own. And she also she did auctions, which she's probably most well known for. And frankly, she started doing auctions because she didn't have a huge amount of capital, like some booksellers that build up a capital and they can buy and own the stock. She wanted to handle good material, but couldn't afford to, buy and hold a lot of it. So she was able to get some really important consignments. and did some really magnificent auction catalogs. And so that was probably her career while she was on her own, was focused on auctioneering. And so there are 24 really amazing auction catalogs that are available that she did. And she sold the Zamorano 80 twice, the same two different collectors, which is the pinnacle of, for a lot of Californiana collectors, is to get the complete Zamorano 80. And those catalogs aren't just catalogs, they're works of art and works of bibliography. So I was, like I said, it was kind of a happenstance that I got introduced to her. But after a couple of years, I went out on my own, and I went my merry way, so to speak, but I stayed in touch with her. But I didn't realize until years later how much she had influenced me. And, you know, I kept in touch with her and saw all the things that she was doing, and hadn't really, you know, seen her though very much in the last 15 years. And so I wanted to, you know, get to my escapade here. It's a mixture of joy and sorrow, actually, for me. Late last year, I emailed her, and she was living in the Austin area still, not in that big house that I remember, but she had changed to a different location. I went to see her. My wife and I, Nicole, you're seeing my wife's name on the Zoom since I'm using her laptop here. She and I wanted to go over and see Dorothy. I emailed Dorothy. A couple days later, I get a response from Dorothy's daughter. And I'm like, uh-oh. And Dorothy's daughter, who I'd known when I was young, who had helped her mom some in the book business, told me, said, I'm sorry, but my mom is suffering from advanced dementia, and she is not in good shape. And I kind of stopped for a minute, and it was hard to imagine. I had no idea that Dorothy was suffering, you know, in that way. And so I responded to her daughter, Jasmine, and I said, you know, is there anything I can do? And she says, well, I'm here. I'm trying to organize what's going on. Dorothy had scheduled an auction, and she had a few $100,000 worth of consignments sitting there. And her daughter had to come in. This dementia and mental illness came on very fast. And her daughter lived out of state and would talk with her mom, but didn't realize the extent what was going on. So her daughter comes in and has to try to return all this material to consigners. And that was her primary goal. And so she spent 3 or 4 months there in Austin area at her mom's house trying to figure out what was going on and who needed to get this stuff back, which she did finally accomplish. Excuse me. So in the meantime, I wanted to help in any way I could. And I asked her what was going on with everything, and Jasmine, and she says, well, I've got to get all the reference books out and sold. And of course, for me, I knew what was in that reference library and how important it was. And I told her, I said, well, I'd be interested, you know, in any of that. And she says, well, she says, Kurt, I know you would, but I have to get it out of this house. There's some reasons we got to, because of the state, and there's some issues going on. So I've contracted with booksellers, Oak Knoll Books, Rob Fleck and Michael Laird, who is a Texas bookseller. They are buying the reference collection, and you know, you can talk with them. But she goes, I really would like to see you, and you can maybe help me sort some of the archive and some of the other stuff. So we drove to her home, and Dorothy she was alive. She was in a care facility, and unfortunately, she was not in a position where I could say goodbye or hi to her even. But I was with her daughter, and at Dorothy's house were mementos and, you know, books and special items that reflected 45 years of her being in the book trade. And there was also some stock. Dorothy wasn't all auction material, so I helped Jasmine sort some of that stock, and she sold that to some various booksellers. And then the reference library, the bulk of it, Rob Fleck, I don't know if you guys know Rob, his father Bob formed Oak Knoll Books in Newcastle, Delaware. Rob's got a lot of energy. He's probably late 30s. He flew down to Austin, got a U-Haul, filled it with over 300 boxes of Dorothy's reference books, and drove them all the way back to Newcastle. And so I knew where those were, and I'll get to that story in a second. But the rest of the stuff, there was a shed. this is going to make you cringe a little bit. There was a shed, a storage shed in Dorothy's property, and she had put out in this shed boxes and boxes of her own publications, her catalogs, some of her reference material, this huge collection of bookseller catalogs. Well, before I got there, I found out it wasn't climate controlled. The water had got in there, moisture, bugs. They'd already thrown out like 80% of it. And my heart just sank because who knows what was in there. I mean, it would have been something to say that, but I went in and I was able to salvage out of what was left some significant archive material, especially from her earlier days, which I have. And then also some reference and some books that were in there. She didn't store the rare stuff, but in terms of an archive and research and her life, there was a lot of stuff in there. So I spent a couple days going through that and got as much as I could of that. And in terms of her archive, in short, part of it went to SMU, the Golier Library, and a significant part went to me, because my collection is not just books and a few manuscripts and such. It's kind of reached the point where I'm trying to preserve the history of the book trade or book collecting, and very few bookseller archives survive. It's sad and kind of amazing that apparently every time a bookseller goes, everything gets scattered or thrown out. So there's some exceptions, but so I knew how important it was to do what I could to save what I could. And so I think Nicole and I, we had 10 or 15 boxes of stuff that we brought back from that first trip. And in the meantime, I called Rob Fleck. And Rob goes, Kurt, he says, when I get it up to Newcastle, he says, I'm going to unload all these, get them out on the warehouse shelves. This is like 8,000 books. And he says, you're welcome to come up. I'll hold them for you first. You can come up there and go through, and anything you want, you can pull. Well, this is the middle of the pandemic. This is late last fall. I hadn't gone anywhere really, hadn't done anything. But when it comes to books, I risked my life one time in the pandemic for books, and this was it. So I said, I'm going to get on a plane. I'm going to fly to Philadelphia, which is very close to Newcastle. Flew up there, and Rob picked me up at the airport, and I spent, it was 3 full days immersed in his store, which is an amazing store. If you guys have been there, it was an old opera house, and it's like 3 levels, and it's just chock full of wonderful items. So he takes me into the space, and he didn't know how many books I was interested in. He just knew that Dorothy's stuff meant a lot to me. So I went through this and started making stacks, and I just would pull anything that looked interesting. I didn't know how I was going to pay for it. I mean, that was the concern, was what's here and what can I salvage? So I only pulled, no, I say only, maybe 1,000 to 1,500 items. And there were stacks everywhere, and Rob walks in, he looks at him and he goes, well, I guess you are interested in a lot of stuff. And so we, in the end, we came to, I said, well, look them over. And I said, I know it's going to take you a while to look through these. We can't come to a price or anything until you've had a chance to look. So he industriously, over a month or so, went through them, came up with a price. He and I agreed it was fine. We worked that out. And then it was like, well, how in the heck are we going to get these books back to my house? He goes, oh, we'll just send them by freight. And I'm like, freight? I go, oh, okay. And so he packed 2 pallets of books, must have been 50 boxes of her material. And I was really, really hoping my wife, Nicole, would not be home when they were delivered. But we work from home, so there was no chance on that. So the truck pulls up, and we have a cul-de-sac. Truck couldn't, it was a big semi. And I looked outside and I said, oh, yeah, I bet you that's for me. And she looked at me and said, what is going on? She knew I'd been buying some stuff, but she didn't realize the extent. So the big semi couldn't come down our cul-de-sac. So the guy unloads 2 giant pallets of books with a the dolly to pull them. And so I run down the street, and he and I pull them and put them in the garage. And so we had 2 giant pallets of books sitting in the garage. And let me just say, we got a decent sized house, but it's already full. So Nicole was very supportive. She didn't give me too much of a hard time, but it was like, where are we going to put these? And so I've unloaded all this stuff, and every square inch of my space and then some is now filled with Dorothy's reference collection that I saved. And when I say the core of her collection, everything that was her working copies that she marked and annotated. items that were inscribed to her, items that were third or fourth generation bookseller items, where she had acquired a bookseller's reference library from years earlier, and it goes back into the 1920s or 30s. The Eberstats, famous book dealers, a lot of their material was in there. So in all, I gathered probably 60, 70 boxes of material. And I hope, if she's looking down on me up there, that she's happy that her core of her collection has been preserved. And the rest of the books, she asked, well, what happened to all the other books? Well, I was talking with Rob, and Rob has issued so far a couple catalogs, and there's still plenty of really interesting books available for sale from Dorothy's library. If you go on the Oaknell website, he cites the provenance in all of them. And so the rest of them will go to hopefully homes that are, happy to have them. But again, it was an opportunity for me. I don't usually buy in bulk. There's a Larry McMurtry story, which I won't go into, which Jerry alluded to, where I did buy in bulk. And one other time, Fred Adams, who was the head of the Morgan Library back in 2001, his collection was sold at auction, and I bought probably 30 or 40 boxes of his biblio stuff, which had some amazing things in it. So, but I'm writing some essays about Dorothy just to kind of preserve her legacy in terms of a bookseller, what she did in more detail, and a little bit what she was like. I've had a lot of people ask me about that, and I wanted to do it anyway. So I keep everybody, if you keep an eye on my blog and my, you'll see that come up hopefully in the next few months. And so that's my latest escapade. It was a big, giant bulk purchase, and I'm trying to get through it in catalog, and I find gems every day. Some of them get me really excited, and some of them kind of almost bring a tear to my eye. I don't know. I'm a sentimental guy, and I love the association material and history. So that's the latest, but there'll be plenty more. Every day there's a box coming in, pretty much, on acquisitions. So I'll be glad to take any questions or talk any further if we can manage it on the Zoom. So I see a lot of friends.
Bibliophile Society usually get a gift book for their present to thank them for their presentations. And we have a book for you that I acquired from William Reed's company. The covers are a little soiled, but I think you'll like the association. The title of the book is On the Gathering of a Library by Hal H. Smith. He was a lawyer from Detroit, a longtime member of the Detroit Club, and the founder of the Friends of the Detroit Public Library. He was a great benefactor of the Clemens Library, both in books and in paintings. A review of his book was published in July 1943 in the Quarto, a publication of the Clemens Library. The reviewer wrote, "On the Gathering of Libraries has just been issued by Detroit, privately printed in Detroit. Besides being a real contribution, it is a lot of fun. Mr. Smith makes clear that he uses the word gathering instead of collecting, because the latter is not quite right for his job. The word assembling is altogether too formal, while gathering implies a sort of joyous selection. That is what Hal Smith has achieved in gathering his library and writing about it. All our friends should read his book." The Detroit bookman, William Van Dyke, was a friend of Smith's and a friend of the Clemens Library as well, having donated numerous paintings and books to the library. Van Dyke sent a copy of Smith's book to a noted New York bookseller and auctioneer, along with this ANS that was dated April 20, 1943. "My dear Mr. Swan, my dear friend Hal H. Smith of Detroit has published another book, and one I feel you should have, and am therefore forwarding it to you." And it was signed William Van Dyke. Arthur Swan kept the book for 16 years, and then he gave the book to another noted New York bookman, David Kirschenbaum, the proprietor of Carnegie Bookshelf. On the front free end paper, Arthur Swan wrote, "From Van Dyke to Swan, and now to my dear friend Dave, with the best regards, in memory of a great evening at Forest Hills." Signed June 29th, 1959 by Arthur Swan.
Wow.
To memorialize this occasion of your presentation before the Florida Bibliophile Society, we will add one more item to this book, a presentation sheet with the names of everyone who attended this meeting, both online and in person. There you go,
Wow.
Kurt.
Wow. That's special,
Thank you.
Jerry. That's great. I love that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll have it in the mail probably in a week or so. All right.
That's great.
Yep.
I appreciate the opportunity, to speak to everyone, and it's just a thrill for me to be here, and I'm glad you invited me.
We thank you for your presentation, and I myself apologize for the audio problems we had. All right. We're going to continue with this meeting. We have some local business to do. You can stay on if you'd like. All right. The local FBF members should, because we have some local business for you. All right. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to our treasurer to make an announcement.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt.